Hello and welcome to Ava's new media channel. If you value the work that we do here at Ava, lifting up the voices of women in these challenging and exciting times, then please become a member and a patron at our Patreon account. When you become a member, you gain access to Ava magazine, where we weave many inspiring voices of women today, all across the world, women weaving their voices in a collective map and a prayer. From as little as £2 a month, you can gain access to Ava magazine in digital format and will be supporting our work. So thank you. Okay. Hello and welcome to our listeners. Today I have Alison McDowell here. Alison is an independent researcher, a mother, and she lives in Philadelphia in the US. And her story, she'll tell us more about her story as an activist. Basically, it is my understanding, it was being a mum that brought Alison to her activism, and she was responding to what she was seeing playing out in the education field and standing up to defend our rights and her children's rights for an education, and where we're all heading if we do not kind of open our eyes and make a clear stand at this time. Thank you for joining us today, Alison, and welcome.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much for including me today, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation. And it's great to connect with people globally, because I think this is a global campaign to sort of, contain humanity, to contain our humanity, and through finance and militarized technologies. And everybody has sort of a different perspective on how they see this rolling out in their community. I live in Philadelphia, which is on the East Coast in the US, and we're a very poor city. We're a Black city, and we're a city that is being targeted by people who would seek to profit from poverty management. And the education system was a big piece of that. So sort of really a miseducation system. And it was something that I was not, I came into in a very naive way, and I would bump up against things in my circumstances as a parent that didn't feel right. And, it even started when my child was in elementary school, where our district was rolling out that you had to have like FBI fingerprints to volunteer in the schools. And it was very clear at times that there were intentional disconnects between the schools and the community involvement, or only on very mediated levels. And so I pushed back, like I started pushing back early, but it was only when the district hired a consulting firm to close 23 of our schools and lay off 3,000 teachers. And this was, I believe, 2015, that this big transformation was happening. And I thought, well, this isn't right. And at the time I thought, oh, it's just because they don't understand how wrong they are. Like, if we just could explain to them how wrong this all is, like, start to fix it and make it right. And I didn't understand the nature of the globalized takeover that was happening at the time. 2015 in Philadelphia, Boston Consulting Group was hired, and they recommended these closures. And then right on the heels of the school closures and the disruption that happened in the spring, in the summer, that August, they brought in a consulting group to implement two things. One was consolidated enrollment, so that families could apply to public schools, charter schools, which are like, I guess, the academies maybe in the UK, and even religious schools and private schools all on one application. And then those applications would be reviewed by an entity outside of the school district. And so they were trying to do that, as well as grade schools using these report cards on rubrics around data. And so they had decimated our schools. The charters were in safe harbor for a year, so they weren't comparing apples to oranges data-wise, and then they were going to sort of use the disruption that they caused to justify like further closures and further harmful measures, like implementation of data-driven interventions into low-performing schools that they had essentially undermined intentionally. And these were schools, many of which were serving, low-income folks, Black folks, immigrant folks, English as a second language communities. And so that harm was being done intentionally. And we showed up, and this was a meeting in late August, which here, most everyone, like there's very hard to find childcare or summer care in the end of August. So if that's when families are away or they're taking care of their kids. So to plan a meeting and a series of focus groups for late August indicated that they clearly did not want people to actually show up to these meetings. So we showed up to the first meeting and we called them on it. And we said, because they were going to use our standardized test scores, to justify further, sort of solutions and interventions in the schools. And we said, this isn't fair. This, where's this money coming from? Whose interests are being advanced? You caused this disruption. Now you're causing further harm. And at that point, the next day, they shut down all of the other community meetings in favor of a focus group, hand-select focus group. And at that point, it was very clear that this wasn't about making schools better. And it turns out that funding behind that was from the Dell Foundation, was from Michael and Susan Dell, which is, Dell Computers. And so in my naivety at the time, I was like, oh, okay, so this is about selling computers, right? Selling hardware and software and making money on computers. But I didn't realize until I was watching the film Snowden, and he was trying to justify his sort of credentials to this journalistic team. And he threw down his Dell ID. And he's like, and here's my Dell ID. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's up with Snowden and Dell? Well, he was a contractor. Dell is one of their major contracts is with the NSA, the surveillance agency. So it wasn't just about selling computers. It was also about data surveillance and profiling children within these larger militarized electronic space as human capital, right? Like risk profiling children and embedding that into the education process, like embedding literally state surveillance into the education process, which will move forward more and more with artificial intelligence and AI and feedback loop. So at that point, I was like, oh, wow, this is really so much bigger. And so, I spent a number of years fighting standardized testing because they were weaponizing data, right? And we're seeing this in the health system, the weaponization of data and the controlling of numbers to shape narratives, to shape outcomes in a certain way that advantages billionaire investors. And I thought, well, if we could just stop the testing or refuse the testing, then we could slow this down. And I did that for several years with a national group and with some small group of educators, not nearly large enough group of educators, but a small group, mostly parents, across political spectrum, right? Like these were people from across this political spectrum who were fighting the use of data in this way to profile children. And eventually our school district was fine with our opt-out process, which was sent out huge red flags, and I couldn't understand why. And it was because they were going to shift to technological systems that would data mine children all the time. So all of the work that we had done in terms of opt-out was now fueling a shift towards all the time data surveillance through technology. They would say, oh, well, we don't need an end-of-year test. We should just have you on these systems all the time, and you'll never know when you're being tested, but the data is always being collected. So that was a real eye-opener. It was really sickening, to realize that, for me, that was a big life lesson. Not that we knew that at the time. Like, we thought that that was the tool we were going to use. We will take their data back, and we will not let them have it. But in a sense, they were already a step ahead of us, right? And so they could say, look, the families are opting out of these tests. Therefore, we need to impose this new program of ed tech and benchmark testing and growth testing. And in fact, you're saying that it's not good just to test. Education is more than reading and math scores. So now we want to test behaviors. Now we want to test art. Now we want to have a rubric for every single thing that you could possibly do in education. And you're right, we should test the whole child. So every bit of the narrative they co-opted and was used against us. So at that point, unfortunately, I made very little headway with the educators, like people in the education system. And I think, I will say that many of them are working in very tough conditions. They're very stressed, and this is all by design. They're kept just barely afloat. So they can't organize very well to oppose these systems, but I wasn't getting anywhere. And so essentially I sort of packed up my toolkit and moved on to looking at this through a lens of poverty management, because we are a very poor city, and the nodes of that are coming for human capital bonds, which are being developed by the central banking system, are education and healthcare and supportive housing that are linked into smart sensor technology. So there are these three, and health education is also workforce training. Healthcare also includes mental health and addiction treatment, and then the supportive housing is sort of combines all of those nodes. So I just keep following the energy, to where people might have a mind to see, and then ultimately my journey has landed me in pandemic, which, I had thought the model that they're going for is that there will be no more bricks and mortar schools. You will not go to school. You might go to a drop-in center occasionally to check in on your pathway program, which is like a prescriptive model, but you're not going to go to school with kids your age and socialize. You're going to be an independent actor with a digital identity interfacing with the digital world. And that's all about data mining and turning people. It's a biocapitalistic model. And you can read, there's an organization in the United States that's behind this, which is called Knowledgeworks and Strive Together. They're based out of Cincinnati. And they have a bazillion white papers. Like, none of this is hidden. People are like, it's a conspiracy. I'm like, no, it's because people don't read industry white papers. Like, they don't actually read what industry is saying the plan is. And then some people will say, well, it will never happen. Like, oh, that will never happen. Well, I'm like, well, wealth is so concentrated. These individuals all over the world need a place to channel their capital. They're going to channel it through human beings, through privatized benefit systems, including education, health, and housing. So to just say it's not going to, you don't believe it's going to happen is very, misguided, I think, because it is happening. And I thought I had more time. Like, I thought I had maybe 7 to 10 years to try to explain this to people and to convince people that it was going to happen. And now the COVID response has been the trigger event, and that it's been woven into, what Corey's work has been done on the fourth industrial revolution and the global economic reset. That's the trigger. And that the social distancing and the expense of the reopen measures and the consolidation of the supply chains is all feeding into this shift. And people simply don't have the bigger picture. A lot of the reason I do is my training weirdly is in art history and cultural landscapes. So I'm trained to sort of look at the thing on the surface and then look underneath and look at the system it's embedded in. Mm-hmm. And so I use a tool, it's called LittleSis. It's a crowdsourced software mapping tool, which is, I will say, rather cumbersome because you have to hand enter all of this data, but I use it like a mind map sort of interactive bibliography to store all of these white papers from the World Bank and from McKinsey and from UBS, and to hold all of that space. But you can map the networks over time and see all of these overlapping layers. And I don't know that the people who are involved in this even fully comprehend what they're a part of, because they're only trained to know a very narrow slice. Here, just do your job, do this very narrow slice, and then you will have plausible deniability that you don't know what's unfolding. Well, I think it's important, and this was something that a learning that I came to just in process, right? Because I came into it, I'm a middle-class white woman with a graduate degree, with a fair bit of comfort. So and I did well in school. I complied. I was a good, I was brought up in the system to not see the other parts of the world. So that's, and really it was through my education activism that those doors opened to connect with people who were coming from very different life experiences than mine, who have been systematically harmed by these systems, right? We're not necessarily meant to have, relationships, like peer-to-peer relationships with people who are very, who are coming from different places. And so I just want to emphasize in gratitude to all the people that I have connected with on my path who have broadened my understanding of the system.
Yeah.
But once we understand compulsory education, because my fight was for a neighborhood school. I was trained sort of within the framing of the social justice fight to fight for the neighborhood school. And that's in my mind, I thought we need civic space, we need places of engagement. And that was my safe space as, an achieving, behaving, young white kid. That was my comfortable space. And so that was what initially I was fighting for. And now I'm realizing that the system, and I don't know how it is everywhere, but of compulsory education is really to shape human beings to meet the needs of those in power for the economy of the time, right? Good or bad, compulsory education shifted people from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy to a knowledge economy, a service economy. And now essentially what we're looking at with this global reset is that we are looking at a future where the billionaires are world building a space for themselves and their robots, and a very thin layer of bureaucrats who will interface with them, and then the masses who will be serfs. And this will happen in both the physical world, but really virtual world building. So capitalism needs to in order to grow in a world of limited finite resources, the growth of the next version of capitalism in this robot world is in virtual space. And they have to build it. It has to actually be built and coded. So all of the emphasis on STEM and STEM training that has happened for the past 8 to 10 years, and Obama was huge on this, it is just as they train the kids on the farm to be the kids in the factories, now they have to have the coders. And just as people, the people were sacrificed to build transcontinental railroads to access resources, they were trained to build skyscrapers to serve the interests of, these urban real estate interests. Now what's being built is the virtual world. And you have to understand it as a world that's inherently militarized, because the internet is the progeny of the US military interest. That's just what it is. So to understand what's happening in education, you have to have that as the backdrop. The next task for the next generation, maybe several generations, as these people in power, who I think are coming from a very dark place, see it, is to build the virtual world. Because it actually has to be coded. And it's coming through like a virtual reality video game scenario and crypto economics. And that's where capitalism is going. So essentially what they're going to do is that can be done in isolation. That can be done online. And in fact, if people are in isolation, they are more vulnerable because they can't organize to defend themselves. And so what's being framed out in education is a process of lifelong learning, which for most people, you hear that and you're like, yeah, of course, because I'm not the same person I was even 2 years ago. I learned a lot. But the lifelong learning that is the agenda of this new education system is a pathway, is a prescriptive pathway that is decided by others than you. It is not about personal agency, it is not about community care, it is about advancing a very specific agenda of compliance. Like you can go fast or slow on their pathway, but it's their pathway and they're going to put you on it. The algorithms and the AI will put you on it. And in order to risk profile you and figure out what your path is, they need that data. So the ed tech situation, these platforms are going to mine children not just for what their cognitive skills are, their intellect, but also their behavior. And that's really what they want, is they want social, emotional learning data, and they want to know who are the leaders, who are the followers. Are you someone who has empathy? Are you someone who has no empathy? Because they need to know that to put you on which path to engineer their systems. And then as you proceed on their path, their education, lifelong learning path, they will be making bets on if you comply or if you do not comply. And there will be gateways along this, at which point these pay for success finance deals, which I can talk about, will be triggered. Like, did you meet your performance standard? Did you perform as expected? Did you meet your quota, not just of coding, but also behavior? And I think that's what is very imperative for people to understand moving forward, is in a world where robots are taking over and avatars and AI are taking over not just manufacturing labor and industrial labor, but knowledge labor and service labor, the role of people as value is that they will gamble on us as people in a game, really. And that's their utility, is whether or not we go along. And they are training these children. They need to capture the children. I mean, they don't really, they're looking to probably, jettison the older generation. They need to erase any awareness of the old world. That needs to go away. And then they need to raise up the children, their timeline is 2030, 2035. So that's the toddlers today. That's today's toddlers. They're the target. They need to be captured, either in utero or in preschool, to bring them up so they don't even know they're in a box. That they're going to be brought up in Google's box and they will not even know that they're in Google's box because they never knew that there was anything else.
Wow. And
so those of us who can see the boxes, and I'm not to say I'm out of the box. I'm clearly, we're doing Zoom. We're in, people get very mad at me all the time to say, well, you're doing this, so you're a part of the problem. Yes, we're all in the box. But those of us with different awarenesses, have a responsibility to take action. I think both direct, nonviolent action and spiritual action in opposition to this program, because I think that's the only choice. So, but anyway, schools. So what will they look like? So you will have these drop-in centers. They've planned on, it's called learning ecosystems. So it's decentralized, and it will sound good because they're very good. They have something called frameworks. They hire frameworks to do the social science research and the focus group research to say, this is where people are, this is their belief system, and this is where we need them to get to. And so here is the press releases, here are the guided conversations, here are the tweets, here's your whole toolkit for how to talk about this to take people from where they are to where we need them to be in terms of acceptance. And the MacArthur Foundation, which is very active in the UK, has been significantly behind this, working with Mozilla on digital badging. And they've been doing this, they've been pushing digital media and learning for 15 years and pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into this campaign. So they will say, look, the city is your classroom, and I live in Philadelphia, and I'm fortunate to live near a bunch of cultural centers, and, there's some little bit inside me that says, oh, well, when this learning ecosystem happens, especially because real estate, education options here drive real estate prices and value, right? Property rights, your education system is linked with this value system. All the people who fled the city for the suburbs, well, where are their kids going to have their badge earning opportunities in their ecosystem? Like at the Chili's, like we have the hospitals, we have the museums, we have the, the finance floors. I mean, I'm not saying any of these are good things, but like we've got all this stuff in the city. So all the people who ran out of the city, like for the chasing the education option, if the learning ecosystem rolls out, they're going to get bit in the butt about all of this. But it's a sick system, because ultimately, if your idea of education is not that children go to a physical place with children of their own age, with people who are supposed to care for their well-being and help develop their talents, which I'm not saying the existing system ever has necessarily been, particularly for, targeted populations. For sure it hasn't. But in an ideal world, that you will be an independent actor out operating in a militarized smart city to do Pokemon Go education, to prove your compliance, to earn a badge, to show that you have a competency for your online learning locker, so AI systems can slot you into a workforce gig micro work opportunity. And that's the model, but they will frame it as the city is your classroom. Isn't this great? And if you're someone who's sitting in my neighborhood and you don't know that, you'll be like, yeah, it sounds great. Like I'm looking around and there's all sorts of awesome ways you could learn in the city here. But certain people will have certain opportunities, and certain other people will have much more circumscribed opportunities into professions that are not valued as a society or economically compensated appropriately. I mean, not to say that there's certain work that isn't valued, like all work that keeps society going is valuable, but like there will be tracks and it will reinforce these racialized systems. But it's all packaged so well, unless someone is like shining a flashlight and saying, it's not what you think. It looks good.
Yeah, it's very tricky like that. You have to get the big picture in a way and see what's being rolled out. It's like that with the whole kind of Agenda 21 and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah. It looks good. They brand it.
It looks good, and you have to kind of be able to take on and see what's being rolled out in the artificial intelligence and the surveillance, and go, okay, what is this, and how, this is the same thing here, packaged up in nice words.
And the power hasn't changed. I mean, that's the thing I keep emphasizing people, is you have to look at systems of power. And that is made manifest often through money, right? Like where is the money? That's always my first thing. Who's on your board? Who's on your advisory group? Where is your money coming from? Because what we've seen in this pandemic backdrop is that the power and the money is becoming way further concentrated in the hands of the same people who are pushing this agenda, who are pushing this program. So my frustration as someone who operates on a left-leaning side, but at this point, I think I'm more communitarian anarchist, because I just see that like people have let me down in so many ways, but people who, in previous years espouse social justice, espouse liberation, like seem to have an understanding of sort of racialized capitalism, are not understanding this. And they think that, oh, soon it's all going to fall apart and now it's going to be our turn to enact some sort of more liberatory option. And they're not seeing that these traps have been laid, and in many respects, as they're advancing agendas that are going to be against them, they're doing the work of the oligarchs. And they don't, most of them don't know, but I keep trying to engage with people directly to say, like, sort of lay it out and say, no, this is actually what it's happening. Like, this is what prison reform is actually about. And they choose not to engage. So it makes it harder and harder. So at this point, many of the people who seem to be able to see this, they're moms. I mean, not exclusively, but many are mothers, and they come from, you know, across political spectrums. But I think they also are connecting with this from a place of spirit, you know, and not necessarily organized religion, but they're coming to this with these hearts of understanding, like care of humanity, and they're able to see it. And I'm saying this as someone who is not that. Like, I mean, I my family has a fraught history with organized religion. I've never really been, you know, part of any of that. But it keeps finding me. People keep finding me, and that's what that comes over, is people with big hearts who have a strong heart. I think you have to have a spiritual grounding to have the strength to look at this, right? Yeah. And I think maybe that's the piece. If you're actually able to look, to suck it up and look, like, you need to be able to be drawing on something beyond yourself. And those are the people who see it. So
yeah, I totally agree. I think it's well, from where I'm, you know, in order to be not completely overwhelmed by the size and scale of it, there needs to be a sense of the size and scale of our spiritual origins and, like, the power that we contain, and that this is a spiritual battle. On one level, it's it's the light and the dark, and it's not hopeless by any means, you know, because how can it be hopeless with the scare, you know? But it is scary, and it does take a lot of courage and willingness to know there's a way through, to keep in connection and keep seeing and keep moving forward with it.
Well, and I'm very fortunate. So I work, I have paid employment half time, and I do this, I follow money the other half of my time. And, you know, I never knew that all of the stuff that I was uncovering would end up coalescing in COVID. Like, pandemic was not anything on my radar that I would thought would be their tool. But my grounding is, so I work in a botanic garden, and I work on this very ancient land. It's the land of the Lenape people. And actually, like, I did not know this, but Philadelphia is the confluence of all of these ley lines, and we're actually at the fall line between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. Like, it runs through the place that I work. And so for the years I've been, like, most of my work is at a desk, you know, and I ask people to, you know, individual people, fortunately, I'm the membership, to support this work that we're doing, which is sort of land-based healing, a lot of it. I have colleagues who run an urban farm on this land. And but I walk on this 40 acres, and I see the seasons, and I see the invertebrates, and I'm just physically out on land. And I think that's, for me, the balance, is to be able to have books. And I think I would say it isn't hopeless, because when you understand the cosmos, like, there's so much that's not people. Like, there's so much that Michael Bloomberg and Bill Gates are not in control of, right? Yeah. I mean, not just like non-human kin, but the larger earth forces that are in place. And if you come from that space, then there's hope. And I think a lot of people, I've lost a lot of friendships of people who find what I say uncomfortable because I don't have the answer. They're like, well, what's the answer? It's very inappropriate for you to raise this if you don't tell me what to do next. Yeah. And, like, I feel like for millennia, this has not been right. The human capital bond markets that are coming are based on the doctrine of discovery, if not going further back. They're based on this idea that you can take land and break up families and take people's bodies and use them for your own purposes. This is not anything that happened just recently. This is a very long-standing process. And to back it up, like, we have to acknowledge that, but there's always been struggle and resistance. And so I draw a lot on a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a professor of biology, and she's, I believe, Potawatomi Nation, and she looks at the world through sort of an anti-capitalist lens of both of indigenous science, and she talks about Chittagin, which is the tinder fungus, and her people were pushed out of New York, like into the Great Lakes, and they carried their fire in this tinder fungus. And that I feel like when we talk about hope, that is our model. Like, we may not be able to push all of this back in our lifetime, but if we do not commit, those of us who know, to carrying forward the knowledges and that hopeful spirit, then the spark goes out, and then what does that mean for everybody who comes after? Then that's just gone. So,
absolutely.
I'm kind of all over the place. I'm sorry.
I just so glad to kind of, to be introduced to your work from Corey, and just seeing what you're doing so committedly and passionately.
And anybody can do it. Like, I hate economics. I hate computers. Like, I'm an art person. Like, and actually, unfortunately, I do symbols, but I'm also kind of concrete. So trying to get a handle on this. But, I will say, so when you see things, and I do feel like in this, like, I feel like I'm supposed to do this, whatever this is. Like, there are too many things that have crossed my path that say, you need to, like, can you walk away from this thing that you know? And it's too dark, like, once you know it. So one of these things, this idea of human capital bonds, you can look it up. It's called Pay for Success Finance. It actually, the structure of it is underlaid by something called an outcomes-based contract, a performance-based government contract, which ties back to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve in the mid-1990s, which is very odd, but the charter school system started at the same time, so with the academy system in the Twin Cities in the mid-1990s. And they created performance metrics, because ultimately the goal of these technocrats is to total systems engineering of humanity for efficiency. And they will say, they're the people who should be making the decisions to control everyone else, because they're, above everyone else. But so this control system started, but then it really metastasized in the UK through the work of Sir Ronald Cohen. And he was the instigator of the first social impact bond. And if you Google social impact bonds in the United Kingdom, I mean, it's riddled. Your whole country is riddled with, you don't realize it, but he was a Harvard MBA. So, I mean, he got it probably from here, but carried it back. And he's very much connected to Israel. And he has, this social finance group. And so they created these instrumentalized structures of, quote unquote, sort of improving broken people. It's also being used in the environment, but financializing people for profit. And it's based on metrics, it's based on data, it's based on performance targets. But now, as that interfaces with wearable technology systems and total surveillance and digital identity, you can literally turn people into putting them in a digital maze. Right? Like, you take someone who has been harmed, who is trying to navigate a harmful system, and you put them as a rat into a maze. As they navigate the maze, these financiers are making money on their performance targets. As nonprofit, the third sector manages these people. So the third sector is this instrumental piece of running the maze. It's like D&D game, right? Like, that's what's coming. And so folks need to look up Sir Ronald Cohen. They need to look up social impact bonds and Pay for Success Finance. They need to look up Michael Bloomberg and what he is doing in terms of smart city rollout, data-driven government, taking data, using data and analytics to usurp community control over their futures. So yeah, this is all very much embedded in the UK and tied to hedge funds, because they're going to be, people say it's called Pay for Success Finance, and it actually has bipartisan support generally globally, because on the liberal side they say, oh, this is great, we have austerity, we can't pay for services for the poor, we can't pay for public education, but investors will pay, but only if it works. And so that's the Republican side. They're saying, oh, if it works, we're getting our good value for our money. So it's this very twisted connection between the liberal side and the conservative side of agreeing on these pay for performance metrics. But the goal is is that they're going to consolidate these financial instruments, these deals, these contracts with the government. And once they consolidate them, they can securitize the debt behind, right? So essentially what they're doing is they're turning portfolios of poor people or low-income students into bond markets. They're turning them into the toxic bundled mortgages of the real estate crisis. Because after 2008, that implosion, the wealth got further concentrated, but it still had to flow. So the only thing that they could flow the wealth through was human bodies, was through poverty, and that was the growth market. So they're actually bundling poverty management as a global hedge fund system. But once you securitize that debt, if you've seen The Big Short, you know, the people who made out the most were the people who bet against it, like who bet that it would explode. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to short the lives of children. It's not just about paying if it works. Someone's going to be betting that it doesn't work, right? Someone's going to be betting that it doesn't fix people who are in prison, that it doesn't improve the life conditions for hungry children, that it doesn't improve the pre-K reading scores of refugee children. Like there's going to be, for every, once you securitize the debt, there's going to be equal number of people betting against them in real time with Internet of Things and smart cities. It's crazy, and people just don't have this bigger arc, but that's like a big factor in the UK is the ARC Academies, Absolute Return on Kids. That's what ARC stands for, ARK, Absolute Return on Kids. Wow. It's these sicko hedge fund people. Yes. And now the thing that's really insidious, and again, it's very hard to like tease apart these arguments, is that we have seen a huge push in the US for schools as community schools and wraparound services. So they take poverty, because poverty is the fuel of impact investing, of human capital markets. It can only make more poverty. If you're successful making money on poverty, only going to make more poverty. So they've said all of the kids in our schools, they have these great needs, they're unmet. We're going to do it through the schools. Obama gutted data protection in the schools. So if they provide services in a school setting, the data isn't protected, so the hedge funds can use it. HIPAA, which is the medical protection records, don't apply in school settings in the US. It's FERPA, and Obama gutted FERPA, the privacy protection, so that they could bring in social services into the school, telehealth and telemedicine and teletherapy and all of these systems that will use children as batteries to gather their data and risk profile them. But it's framed as we care about poor people. It's framed as like we care about people, so they're gonna switch police for social workers. Well, yeah, no, we shouldn't have police in our schools. But if the social workers are working for the hedge funds, then we don't want that either. Like, you know, if these deals of wraparound services are tied for these human capital finance pay for success deals, you could have the most lovely social worker in the world who wants to do right by children, but ultimately they're an agent of the state, and if the state is working for Google and Goldman Sachs and UBS Bank and QB Insurance, they won't be able to do their job, so they'll be made miserable and they'll have to leave their job if they actually do their job, or they'll do their job and they'll harm families, and then they'll have their own personal demons to deal with later. So we're looking at a future where if you're lucky, like you're either on the dashboard or you're running the dashboard. And there's a very few people running the dashboard. And I have a child who's now in college. I don't, like, by all instances, they're probably coming from a place of privilege. Do I want them to be a dashboard manager and to have to live with that sickness of perpetrating that against people? I don't. I want them to have a world that is not about coding virtual reality and forcing people into doing that, or if they refuse to be an impact commodity. Like, that's what I'm fighting. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So what does it look like now with schools and colleges reopening? Is some of this in place now as the schools reopen?
I mean, I think it's still very much in play here in the US. I would say most universities are doing distance learning. I mean, for goodness sakes, like I'm glad I'm in a position, I'm not actually paying tuition for my child to have distance learning. It's not good learning, and it's also surveilled. I mean, I understand people are afraid. I'm not dismissing, I'm not saying, I mean, if you look at the CDC numbers in the United States for because I've asked people when they're trying to make these decisions, have you looked at the numbers? The CDC has tracked by age group COVID attributed deaths. So, again, I would say attributed because, again, there's sort of lack of clarity about exactly how those deaths are attributed. From February 1st through July 8th was the last that I looked. It was under 160 deaths, ages 5 to 24. So that was 160 deaths. That is 1.08% of all of the deaths in that age group, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, how are they shaping the narrative? Is it that we think that the other 98.92% of deaths in that age group, that none of those were preventable? Like, if what we're saying is we're trying to prevent child death, we're very afraid of child death and the implications of that, should we not be expanding our lens to look at all of the children who died during that time frame and what was going on in that and how that could be made? To me, to throw over to say we're just going to no longer have human-based education systems in our nation, or perpetrate really traumatic experiences on children through social distancing and plexiglass and data collection and thermometers, at that number, of people, I would, and this is my opinion, I think it's causing more harm. And in fact, I think that the harm of either pushing online education and continuing social isolation, or enacting really repressive biological controls within school settings, is going to cause far more harm than allowing education to take place. And I will say, I have empathy for teachers and educators who are older. I have empathy for educators who are living with a person in a risk category. I have empathy for people who themselves have comorbidities that put them in a risk category. Rather than follow the narrative they're saying, why do we not say, how can we provide a financial subsidy to those people who are in risk categories and make sure they're taken care of while this plays out, and still allow people to be educated in a humane way?
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very legit, I would like to hear from people why that wouldn't be a solution. Maybe pay people more, give them, but we can't turn our backs on learning and knowledge sharing as a face-to-face human interaction. I think that the harm that will be done to children through social isolation, especially children who are living with housing insecurity, with food insecurity, potentially in an environment that is abusive, to sort of say that we will indefinitely continue this practice of lockdown and have social isolation of children, and to not be able to learn and have a peer group, is really misguided and selfish. And that's where I'm coming from as a mother, is trying to sort of bring these other pieces into the conversation, because they're talking about 5 years. Ultimately, these human capital markets need to have something called a self-sovereign digital identity. And in the EU, they're advancing this, the Internet of Humans, single data markets. This is real. It's been advancing. The Decentralized Identity Foundation, you can look it up. There's dozens and dozens of companies working on digital identity systems, and it's to aggregate interoperable data. And these systems for these markets will come in with the health passports, and that's how they will advance. And people are not making that connection, that once you have a digital identity tied to a health passport with a digital status, that the badges that we are seeing in education, in the tokens, because they will be blockchain tokens, very likely this will ultimately end up on blockchain, which is a decentralized ledger system. It's not just going to be education badges and tokens, it's going to be health status tokens. And it's not just going to be for COVID, it's going to be for the next illness that they decide, and the next and the next. And people need to look and understand the global financial piece, because you can look up Goldman Sachs has developed white papers around effective lockdown indices for their markets, and indices around mask wearings being offsets for GDP. They're factoring these calculuses of controlling human bodies through, I call it medical martial law, to manage global financial markets. If the financial markets are not meeting the needs of Goldman Sachs, they can just ring up and there's some new viral thing will come up, and then they can implement their effective lockdown system as a break on global economics. And I think far too too few people understand the way in which global finance has control over the public health narrative. They don't know about pandemic bonds, they don't know about vaccine bonds, they don't know about Gavi, they don't know about CP, they don't know about any of these things. And so they would just prefer to say, if you raise this, that you're anti-vax, that you're ignorant or you're no fun or whatever. I mean, I've been told all of these things. I'm like, well, oh, that's not a good source, it's a blog. And I'm like, well, I linked to the World Bank white paper and the Goldman Sachs white paper, like the Harvard Business Review that says you can satellite surveil children to see if they're not vaccinated, like in Africa. And I'm like, where are the social justice people on this? Where are the social justice people on digital identity, biometric digital identity? We're having these uprisings and we're pushing back on the police. But what we're not understanding is the nature of state control is morphing. It has, certain populations have always been way more under state control, and clearly social welfare systems have been a piece of that for a very, very long time. But the brutality is about to be ramped up in very intense ways with wearable technology and smart surveillance and data analytics and risk profiling. It really is, and it's a web that is education, healthcare, and housing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll put the links below so people can do their own research of the white papers and other links that you feel that would be good for individuals to look at if they're interested to understand this more themselves. Because I think that's really important.
I want to be wrong. Like, I would love for someone to put a compelling reason out to say, like, Alison, like, you've missed this key piece over here that means none of this will happen. Like, here's the secret thing that means none of this, but they haven't. Like, very rarely do people even engage in the material. I know. Like, where is it? Bring it. I love it.
Yeah, I think that's the spiritual aspect of us, really deciding we're not going to let this happen, but it's happening.
Bingo.
So yeah. It's right now. Yeah. It
is. And so I will, can I say a little bit about blockchain identity just as an example of what this looks like? Yeah. So right now, the past few years, maybe 5 years, they've been developing what's called proofs of concept. So IXO Foundation is a key player, and they're based out of Switzerland, and Switzerland is the United Nations, and it's global finance banks, and it is CERN, and it's blockchain. It's the crypto valley Zug of blockchain. So IXO Foundation is coming out of Switzerland, and they have partnered with Omidyar Network, which is Pierre Omidyar is the founder of eBay. So it's very interesting. I would say this needs to be understood as racial capitalism. And when we're thinking about resistance strategies, we need to be looking at, in my mind, both the Black radical tradition and the Caribbean slave revolts and marronage, and we need to look at the indigenous sovereignty traditions. Like those are the things that those people have been fighting this for centuries, and that's where we need to look at the resistance. But this racial capitalism piece is linked to these social impact bonds. And so it's no surprise that one of these first proofs of concept is happening in South Africa. Pierre Omidyar is backing it. Pierre Omidyar is eBay, right? So it's auctions. So there's this very sort of both real and symbolic connections between auctions and people, auctioning people, right? We have done this, the auction of people as value for markets and industry for a very long time. That's what the United States was built on, was enslavement of Africans and free labor. And a lot of that was built on family separation and biocapitalism and using women in ways to create these markets through their reproductive systems. And that is a big piece of what's coming with these human capital markets, is controlling reproduction, controlling family life, and the threat of family separation is being woven into all of this, as well as the predictive profiling of epigenetic trauma and ACEs scoring, adverse childhood experiences. So there's very, very strong parallels of history of who is involved and how this is recycling, how the history is cycling again. So IXO Foundation, Omidyar, UNICEF are backing this thing called Trust Lab in South Africa, and they developed a blockchain identity system for pre-K. And so what happened was that they would develop a pre-K franchise, mostly for Black children in South Africa, that would be reimbursed, the government would reimburse by attendance, right? So they would pay the pre-K provider by how many attendance days the child was in the pre-K program. And they came in and they said, it is too complicated for you to take this attendance on paper. And there was probably a racist component, like maybe we think you're fudging your numbers. So we're going to give you an app. And this app is going to assign your preschool a digital identity, and your teachers all a digital identity, and your students all a digital identity. And it may even be the families had a digital identity. So all of these have digital tracking numbers. And so when the child comes into pre-K, you can click them in on the app, and then it will create a token, and this token will transfer, and then that's how you get paid back your pre-K for this child that was, having your services of pre-K provided for any given day. So all of these tokens are building profiles on the children, their families, the teachers, the franchises, at the same time as they're being part of this payment model. So the blockchain identity system is already piloted in South Africa. Now this same company, this shows how dehumanizing it is. They want to use the same technology to manage Internet of Things cook stoves, also in Africa. So this is the environmental piece. So we financialize people, now we financialize nature. We say communities should not be able to use wood-based fires for cooking or heating their homes because it's not environmental. So we will give them a cook stove to replace their cultural traditions of how they've operated in their environment. So we will introduce these cook stoves, but as an impact market for us to get credit for doing good for those people with our goodwill of how we think they should live their life. Just giving them a cook stove is only one data point. That's not enough. That's not enough for a hedge fund, one data point, not nearly enough. We will give them a cook stove that has an Internet of Things sensor, and we will know when they turn it on and when they turn it off, and what days they turn it on and how often. And all of that data, is what will give us our impact profile, so we can get our impact commodity payback on our pay for success deals to save the environment, is by surveilling how these people feed their families and possibly heat their homes. And so really for them, toddlers and Internet of Things cook stoves are the same mechanism. It's all just a way of trading tokens in these global markets. And UNICEF is backing amply. So UNICEF is part of the United Nations. This is framed as United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 4, education. It all has to be mediated through ICT, individual communication technology. It's not even a laptop, really. A phone is preferable, or wearable technology. All of the data will go onto blockchain so that the investors can control the world and the outcomes. And it's crazy because if you look at UNICEF, like UNICEF was backing this, and their innovation fund, which is doing AI and blockchain and drones, they run one of the largest drone bases in Africa, in Malawi, but they're only going to use it for good things, right? Promise. Is their largest funder is Disney. And I believe the foreign, like the state departments of Finland and Sweden, maybe 2 Scandinavian countries, like that's who's backing this, is Disney, because they want the token credits. And my friend Emily, who has a wonderful blog that she hasn't been writing on for a while because she's taking care of family, but it's called Save Maine Schools. She told me 4 years ago, as a 2nd grade teacher, her co-teacher came in and had a program where children in this Maine school were to wear a Fitbit. And the Fitbit was to track their activity levels. And it was a UNICEF program. And if the children met the Fitbit expectations, they would deliver a food packet to a starving child. And this was a program that was brought into her school, her elementary school, for 2nd grade. And she said, one of the kids, which shows you like the open hearts of children, they said, well, wait a minute, if they have the food and the children are hungry, why don't they just give it to them?
Yeah.
Right? And it's because it's an impact market. It's a double dip impact market, so they can profile the health status of the children in Maine. At the same time, they can commodify the hunger status, which is UN SDG 2, of like refugee children. And it's all mediated through technology, and these technologies are connected. They're Star Wars branded. These Fitbits are tied with the Star Wars franchise and Edutopia and George Lucas and Disney and Target. Like, this is how wide it goes. And the UNICEF Innovation Fund is based out of Singularity University in the Bay Area. So people just don't know this. So when you know this, you can't not tell people. And these equations, all of it is about turning people into data and shaping that data to meet a performance metric that's agreed upon, a performance metric that's going to benefit the investors so they can game it. And it's going to be narrow, right? It's never going to fix the problem, because if you fix the problem, you kill the market. It's a profitable market. You never kill the market. You just manage it. You perhaps manage it with slightly less brutality, although the brutality will continue to ramp up over time. So the other piece of this, so this is tied to pre-K identity, and pre-K is a huge market because they need the children, right? They need these children to code the world for 2035. They need these children to be captured so they never see out the box. So pre-K funding is huge in the United States right now. We don't have, and it is a real problem, like affordable childcare, quality, ways in circumstances where families have two-income families, or maybe you're a single parent, like you have to work. So affordable childcare, I agree, is a huge problem, but they want to have it invested, backed by hedge funds, right? They want to, and when it's backed by hedge funds, the children are going to be the toxic bundled mortgages. And the equation they're using to justify this takeover of these toddlers in universal pre-K funding is called the Heckman Equation. It's the guy is Jim Heckman. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist based out of the University of Chicago, and he's funded by George Soros, right? And so now we have George Soros funding the Chicago boys, right? And people sort of think that there's this fraction between, you know, liberal and conservative and neoliberalism. Like, no, it's all in the same puddle. Like, Soros is funding this human capital equation. And what J.B. Heckman said is that the data that they can change isn't IQ. They said, you know, IQ hardens up around the age of 8. And that's not, you know, he didn't say that's not going to work for hedge funds, but that's what he meant. It's not variable enough. What we can change character. We can change character, and they're going to change character digitally with video games and manipulating people in virtual worlds. And so they're using the 5 ocean traits, which is tied in with the Cambridge Analytica and Mark Zuckerberg, to commodify children's social behaviors, their social emotional behaviors, and score them on that, because that's what they can shape. They can take a child from this number to that number in their social scoring, because it's all constructed by psychopathic people, but they have the power, so they're going to impose it on universal pre-K funding. And so, well, how do you score social behavior? Well, you develop surveillance play tables. So you look at Hatch Education, which is based in North Carolina, and they're connected to Microsoft, and they have a play table that's shaped like a flat screen TV flat. And on 2 sides, it has a fisheye lens to record children, their audio and video. And they're supposed to play together so you can score their social behaviors. And they take the video recordings, and then they have rubrics where they score the children. And this is happening.
They're filming the children watching the screen.
So they're playing with like a puzzle, but it's a digital puzzle, or it's a digital game. And I'm sure they will frame it as like a cooperative game, right? And so they get 2 or 3 children on this table, and they film them. And like, who knows what the game is, right? Or to what end? Do they create a game that's frustrating, so the kids show frustration? And they know how kids react to difficult circumstances, and like who gets angry, who shuts down. All of that's being recorded, and it's being recorded as part, it's already in place. So a center for this is in Tulsa. And this is, again, this history. So this is the 100th anniversary of the massacre of the Black community of Tulsa. And that is all being hijacked by Michael Bloomberg right now in Greenwood. And EduCare, this is running through EduCare. It's tied in with George Kaiser, who's like, I don't know, the 6th, at least he's in the top 20 richest people in the world. He might be number 6, I can't remember. But he owns Tulsa. He's very tied in with Silicon Valley. And he's using EduCare, which is also has ties to Chicago and Seattle. And they have these play tables in place. And we disrupted one of their human capital events that was put out by their Strive Together franchise in Tulsa. They were having their big celebration of their, great data impact. And we showed up, and I have and it's very homespun. I mean, if you look at me, I don't get paid for this. I'm a mom because once you see children on surveillance play tables, and you see and you know this history, you can't not tell people. And so I show up in Tulsa with a fellow parent who's wonderful. And you can see that there's the new Tulsa Star, I think she wrote a wonderful piece about Kaiser and EduCare and the takeover of Tulsa, the Kaiser Foundation. But we rolled out my little hand-printed banner. I made it on my kitchen floor, and it says, "Children are not data or human capital impact commodities." And it was a public space. It was a state university lobby. So they couldn't quite kick me out, but we just rolled it out, and we said, hey, this is what's happening. Come to my talk. I gave a talk to 12 people. right? And because people don't know, but that's all I can do is tell the 12 people who showed up. But we, and then I had a live stream, but the guy who came out, who's in charge of the Kaiser Foundation, he was part of the CIA, like poof, then my live feed goes dead, right? But that's what it takes is individual people, moms showing up to say, we do not consent. You cannot have our children. You can't. I mean, you can try, but we're not going to go along. And whatever tools that we have in our power to talk to one another, we are going to oppose that. And what I want to emphasize is that we do have groups, parents from across the world and across the country who are coming from different backgrounds. But I want to really center that this is a history based on racial capitalism and on oppressing indigenous worldviews, both not just, Turtle Island, but also across the globe, any indigenous thought in Africa and India and other places, to erase that out of the world. And that those of us who are coming from places of privilege, need to know that we're not just protecting like white children or our privileged children, but like first and foremost, it has to be these children that have been harmed for all of this time in all of these spaces. Because I do think that like the residential schools and the boarding schools that were used to harm indigenous children in here and in Canada, they're coming back, and they're going to use COVID for family separation and to push children into these boarding places to take them over. And so we have to both know the history and be able to project forward in order to protect them and to put be those of us who are willing to put our bodies and our spirits in front of that, to understand it within that context. And that, I stand in solidarity. These blockchain smart contracts that are enabled through facial recognition technology, like we live in a cloud world. So anything that's refined, a pilot project, early bird childcare in South Africa and Amply, which is the pre-K blockchain ID. Once UNICEF has that scaled, poof, it can be in any place all over the world next week, if not faster. So we have to stand in solidarity with this is being piloted on families in Boa Vista, Brazil, because who receive a poverty subsidy, an income subsidy. This is being piloted on low-income families in China. This is, so the solidarity piece, like for me, I envision this as a global peace movement of mothers to preserve humanity, and that 5G and the technologies that are running this are military occupations of domestic populations. And that soon these technocrats, the Bill Gateses, the Michael Bloombergs, the George Kaisers, these individuals, the Omidyars, they will see disconnected humans as an insurgent threat. And that we need to look at the history of the United States in particular to see how we have dealt with threats to a capitalist centralized like worldview, like of domination in making our plans. Because a worldview of reciprocity and abundance and respect for the environment, that's what's at risk right now. Yeah. That is all what's at risk. And much of it, as you know, has been co-opted and hijacked people who are in this NGO complex, because they are the dungeon masters, right? They are the dungeon masters, whether they know it or not, to run the game. And they have, I would say, very high percentages of those individuals have been co-opted. And then I would just call upon them to people who have been co-opted within environmental movements, within education movements. If you're coming at the space, like I respect your need, especially people who've been disenfranchised, to make a living and feed your families, but we have to find another way. And so if you have to be one thing on the surface, but behind the scenes, like in your heart, making the other plan to work against that, like that is what's happened now. Because I recently drove across half the country, and the 5G towers, you couldn't get away from one on the highways. You always saw the next one.
Yeah. I see that. I travel regularly to see my family, well, sort of 2 or 3 times a year, and it's quite a long drive across the UK, and there's just more and more every time I go, and it's disturbing.
But there's disruption, like I do feel like, I don't think we can play their game, right? Like they would like for them to set the terms of engagement. They want us to come up against them in very prescribed ways. And I think, if you're going up against, the US military and the CIA and the Vatican Bank and the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund and Jack Ma and, Mossad, you know, whoever, like if we're going up against them on their terms, I don't think that that outcome looks very positive. So I think we need to look at other ways. And again, I don't know much about this and I'm still learning, but it feels like this is probably playing out in other spheres of existence. And whether you consider that from a spiritual standpoint or from a string theory standpoint, like I can't believe there aren't other alternate realities out there playing out. And there's this sort of struggle. And I take great inspiration from John Trudell about his understanding of the world and energy systems and predator energy. And so I think, like, if we're able to break some of the spells that people are in to understand what's at stake and how fast things are moving, like maybe through the force of our own spirit of confrontation, the non-cooperation, that's what John Trudell always said, non-cooperation, the spirit of non-cooperation, that we can make progress. So.
Yeah. And I feel like, because, you know, this can't be organized, because any organization is getting co-opted. So even the activist, you know, organizations are then co-opted. To me, this morning I was just in just having some food in the garden. It's sunshine here, and I just thought this is being organized through the heart, you know. And
yeah,
AI does not have the heart. That's what it lacks, and that's our power.
Yeah.
And we need to connect with our hearts and connect with each other through our hearts. You know, it's an incredible web of women, men, you know, across the world. Particularly I'm connecting with the women, you know, and it's so inspiring. And you know,
and we teach each other.
We're all driven,
you know, we teach each other.
We need each other. And it's a global community, you know. We're plopped all over. It's like this web, spider's web, and we're all connected, and we're holding this web. And I feel, I mean, actually, that's an image I've had for many, many years. I used to feel like it was part of the green movement when I associated with the green movement, and I felt like, you know, there was just these people that I feel I'm deeply connected to in my life that live in Canada, you know, America, wherever they are, with this level of consciousness, and that we're each bringing something up, and it's invisible, but in the time when it needs to become visible, it will be visible that there is this web to catch. And now, you know, as I kind of move more into this level of understanding of how much the green movement itself has been co-opted, and it's just seeing the individuals, you know, the individuals who are passionately working away, who are willing to see what's happening, speaking out, and willing to be in the unknown, you know, willing to be in the unknown and not know what the answer is, but know that there is an answer, and we will keep seeking that answer and keep creating. And I think you're right about that, you know, that, you know, the spiritual level of other realities, you know, we really need to stay open to that reality that we are creating. You know, we create our reality. We have to accept that there's this reality is playing out, but we're also very creative. And this is the challenge of the time we're living in.
I agree totally. Yeah, I mean, I have, you know, it's interesting. A very charged word in all of this that you'll see a lot is trust. And the technocrats want to outsource trust to blockchain. So that blockchain is their web of trust. Restoring the web of trust is is how they're framing it. And essentially, like, you know, the more that I'm sort of understanding and thinking about, you know, realities and lifespans and maybe karma and people cycling through physical bodies and moving around, and like there's a part of me that feels like they want to get these digital IDs on so that, like, when people pass and maybe come back, like they've still got their lock on their supply chain, right? Like it's not a reset, that the people who are trying to like capitalize on putting us in these containers like can track us across time and space with these blockchain things, which maybe that's a bit of a stretch. I don't know. I mean, that would be their next step, right? Like if they want to contain us in our physical body and our physical life, which they have for many people for a long time, then they lose people at time when that your body is no longer your thing. But if they can blockchain your soul, right? If they can blockchain the essence of you with somehow with these systems, these mind systems, right? Like how much the neural links and these different things, like again, some of that's embedded in your physical body, but somehow I feel like, and again, I just trust my gut on this, but like their sense is their next stretch is they want to control across all of the levels. Trust is central. And I think for me, both them, like carrying the weight of all of this really heavy stuff, like it's hard to stay positive. Like that's why connecting with people who are in like energy healing and holistic healing has been a real gift for me, which isn't a world I operated in before, because that gives me this sense of hope that there's this other power that I'm out there that we can tap into. And that I think trusting into your path, the path that is in you and in your heart, and that it will come. And you don't know the end of it, right? Like you might not even be able to see the next step, but knowing that there is something that will come. And that trust is like authentic trust, not the blockchain trust, is the trust in your own self within the cosmos, that the thing that you need to do next. And by the time that you get there, you will be able to know what to do next. You don't have to know all the things. You don't have to know how to get to the very end now. Like, but you'll be prepared, and there will be people you will find to prepare you so that when you get to that point, you'll be able to do the next thing if you are willing to shoulder that responsibility. Like, and you don't have to have it all now. And like, I'm just very, I connected with someone recently about like showing gratitude, the importance of showing gratitude. And I just want to express how grateful I am for, people who in big and small ways have reached out and made those connections to sort of teach me the things I needed to know, and sort of hold my hand, through this, because that is something I'm profoundly grateful for.
Yeah, beautiful. I feel really grateful. Corey introduced me to your work, and then I reached out to connect with you, and you've introduced me to other women who I'm now in connection with. I'm really grateful for this rich web of women and mothers, and that are really inspiring to me.
It was so crazy. So yesterday I connected with a friend I hadn't seen in a while, and we had a picnic, and I wanted to take her. There's a botanic, an arboretum, and there's a beautiful, like, 2 hemlock trees that are, I think they're hemlocks, but they're very low to the ground, these very thick trunks, and they make this canopy. And I was like, I want to go have a picnic under those trees and sit there, and I'll tell you about like my recent events, and we'll talk. And so, and someone had told me about prayer flags or whatever. So I brought my husband's one of his old work shirts, and we cut it up to like write down some little thoughts, like prayers for our friends, and we were going to like hang those up after our picnic. And we walked in a creek, and it was wonderful. We said a prayer for the water. And, but as we were sitting under this tree, all of these little spiders kept landing on us. All of these little spiders.
Wow.
Over and over again. Like 6 spiders. And we were afraid of them. They weren't scary spiders, but they little tiny ones. We were like, oh, here you go. And then there's another one. And then we went to go like hang up the prayer flag, and there was this amazing spider web in the tree, like right where we were going. But it was not a typical like flat spider web, but it was like a constellation. It's like a constellation web with this tiny spider right in the middle. It was like the size of, I don't know, maybe a basketball. It was very unusual. And I had connected with someone just recently through the internet who had shared all of these links on the mythology of spiders and like women and world building and weaving the narrative. And I was like, and that happened just the day before. So we had that, and then I have all the spiders, and then we're talking about the webs, and like there's synchronicity. There's definitely synchronicity happening.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't think this was how I was going to spend my 50s, honestly. I didn't
think what you were saying about not needing to know the next step, I felt all my life, on one level I was in training for this time, like about being comfortable in the unknown. I felt that in my life, that I've been in training to be comfortable in the unknown, to be willing to be in the unknown, and just to know that the way will become clear. And I really I felt that like coming into its own in this situation, you know, this level of challenge and uncertainty, and just keep trusting, you know, and being open, not needing to know now, knowing that I will know when I need to take the action, you know, or when I need to do something, the door will open.
Yeah.
And that's how it works. And if the door doesn't open, it's because it's not the moment for the door to open.
Yeah. I'm so opposite. I was always the planner. Have a plan, do the thing, check the box. Oh my gosh, what a basket case. Yeah, and so I had this like longer sort of journey that I was on, and before I went in, I kept seeing all these snakes, these garter snakes, which I love, these little garter snakes. And then at the end there was like a snake, and I sort of feel like, well, maybe that's the next step, is to not be the planner anymore, like not be the achiever, not be the, you know, striver of the getting the gold star, just like, but it's hard to decondition from that world. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who feel the same way, when your identity is sort of validated by, you know, doing what's expected, doing the unexpected, the chaos. And I mean, I think that's something to keep in mind, because if you actually, like, I don't watch TV, but I watch videos and World Bank videos and videos about TRADOC, like the Army Training Command Division, and essentially they're planning out like their future military engagement is like small cell chaos, right? And so I think if we understand that mind space, maybe we have a better sense of what strategies might be useful, and that very much ties in with Marinage too, you know. So, but you know, hopefully by the time we need to, you know, participate, like we'll have the tools we need, both mental and spiritual, you know, to do the things.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
We'll put links below for our listeners to further research the white papers and other links, and take a look at Alison's blog, which is wrenchingthegears.com. And
can I just put in one more plug?
Yeah.
I would just say that in terms of affirming my understanding of the technology systems of digital identity and AI and smart blockchain contracts, the one person who is very expert on this on Facebook, his name is Bantam Joe, Bantam Joe, Joe, and he was the first person who I ever connected with who understood intimately the blockchain contracts as sort of a gamified world. And while it's not great knowing it, because that's the world he worked in for a long time, and only recently was making those connections. So this is real, just to clarify, and that's someone else who's very good to follow on this information, even though he doesn't have a blog.
Bantam Joe.
Yeah, on Facebook.
Great. We'll put the link below as well.
I think the plan is on August 22nd. There's an organization called Insight Seminars, and that Joseph and I are planning to do a seminar on gamified life for finance and military. It's like a 4-hour thing. So I'm not sure exactly. I think it's framed on East Coast time, but I believe it's a free seminar, and anyone. So maybe once I get a link to that, but that's coming down the road, but August 22nd, and people might be interested. Yeah, and that will have, it's like a 4-hour time frame, so it will also have some time for participation.
Great. Brilliant.